So let's begin with a word of prayer. Lord, we are indeed thankful that we can gather, small group, but a group that cares for one another, a group that supports and encourages each other. We can study your word together and grow. We're thankful for that and ask you to be with us this evening and again encourage us that you are a God who's in complete control of everything. And we'll thank you for it in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, the writer of Hebrews has made note of the faith of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The next individual that he's going to refer to is Joseph. Sorry about that. We're losing the voice. But interestingly, Hebrews itself only has one sentence on Joseph's life, and that's something that happens literally as he's about to die. And at that point, Hebrews reminds us that he believed so strongly in the covenant that God had made with Abraham and then renewed with Isaac and his father Jacob, that he knew at some point in history the promised land was going to be returned to Abraham and his descendants. And so he said, you know what? I think I would like to be buried there in that land that God has promised to him. Interestingly, if you go to the book of Genesis, Genesis actually has more material, more chapters on Joseph than it does on Abraham, although the writer of Hebrews spent more time on Abraham. All of this is recorded in one verse in Hebrews, as I noted. Marty, you have Hebrews 11:22.
By faith, Joseph, when his end was near, spoke about the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt and gave instructions concerning the burial of his bones.
God had a significant plan for Joseph, but before he could use him, Joseph had to learn a variety of lessons in terms of both faith and obedience. And the centuries later, the Apostle Paul wrote to young Timothy and said, you know, before God's going to use someone, he needs to do something in their lives. And what he wrote to Timothy, in many ways, pictures what he does for Joseph in Egypt. Artie, I think you have 2 Timothy 2:20 and 21.
In a large house, there are articles not only of gold and silver, but also of wood and clay. Some are for special purposes, some for common use. Those who cleanse themselves from the latter will be instruments for special purposes, made holy, useful to the master, and prepared to do any good work.
So apparently Joseph had a number of things in his life that he had to get rid of so that that which was left could be used by God in a powerful way. And I think that's a general picture of what God does for all of his servants. By way of overview, Joseph spent almost all of his life in Egypt. He traveled to the land of promise only once, the land that was promised to Abraham, and that was on the occasion of burying his father Jacob. And last week, I think I may have messed that up a little bit. I got Joseph and Jacob confused. I think Dan may have got it corrected, but at any rate, the reality is that he only went back to bury the remains of Jacob. Now, it had been approximately 200 years since God made that initial covenant with Abraham. However, because of his faith in God and what God had promised, he was, as I noted, absolutely certain that God was going to restore to Abraham's descendants that land. And so he made the Israelites promise with an oath to make it serious, according to Genesis 50:25, that when they finally returned, they would carry his bones from Egypt back to the land of promise and bury him there. It was that faith that is noted in Genesis 11:22. They just said it's been 200 years since that promise was given, and no sign that it was going to be fulfilled in any way. But Joseph knew that God would keep his promises. If Joseph could not live in that land as his land, at least he could be buried there. And so, according to Exodus 13:19, when the Exodus finally took place 400 years later, his bones were taken back to Canaan. So, for 400 years, his bones remained in a coffin, I suspect as a testimony to everyone that he believed in the promises of God. Talk about an eternal flame. They had an eternal, or at least a coffin that was there to remind them of what God had promised them to do. The birth of Joseph is rather interesting, and it's given to us in Genesis chapter 30. Artie, I think you have 30:22-24.
Then God remembered Rachel. He listened to her and enabled her to conceive. She became pregnant and gave birth to a son and said, God has taken away my disgrace. She named him Joseph, meaning he or God will add, and said, may the Lord add to me another son.
Leah had already had several sons that are among those that from whom the tribes of Israel came, and Rachel had not had one. That in the culture was a disgrace, and she desperately wanted one. God is aware of our needs and of our desires, and in his time, he said, I'm going to take care of that, and you're going to have a son. And she did, and she named him Joseph, and said, I need at least one more, God. And God answered that prayer, and she named the second son Benjamin. Well, she didn't, but he named that. Marty, you have Genesis 35:16, 18.
Rachel began to give birth and had great difficulty. As she was having great difficulty in childbirth, the midwife said to her, don't despair, for you have another son. As she breathed her last, for she was dying, she named her son Benoni, which means son of my trouble. But his father named him Benjamin, which means son of my right hand.
We thought about naming Dan Benoni, but
whatever.
Yeah,
Son of your trouble.
the trouble we have appreciated for so much. There is no doubt that Jacob's favorite son was Joseph, in part because Jacob was much older when Rachel had the son, and I think in part because it was the firstborn to Rachel, whom he loved dearly over his other wife. And Genesis 3:37-2 notes that Joseph tended the sheep for his father's flock. And then in Genesis 3:37, we read
37:3.
37:3.
That's what I said, isn't it?
Mm.
Now Israel, that is Jacob, loved Joseph more than any of his other sons, because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made an ornate robe for him.
Okay, if I asked you to identify that ornate robe, 90%, probably 99% of people would say it's a robe of many colors. We don't really know that. The NIV has accurately translated the word as ornate, and we don't really know exactly what it was. We can thank King James for everybody thinking it was a coat of many colors, which would have been ornate in those days. We're not sure. What is obvious from it is that it was a special robe, and it clearly identified Joseph as being honored above his brothers. And that didn't necessarily go over real big with his brothers. Genesis 37:4.
When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him.
If you read through Genesis 37, 3 times in that chapter, we're told that his brothers hated him. So obviously, God wants us to know that because it's a setting for things that will happen down the road. And now, if Joseph didn't have enough problems with that coat, it's going to get worse. Dan?
Because not only did he have a coat, but Joseph also had dreams. God gave him some dreams in which his brothers were going to serve him. Genesis 37, verses 5 through 8.
Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it." His brothers said to him, "Do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us?" And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said.
Well, let me rephrase that just a little bit. Yeah, he had dreams. That probably wasn't the main cause of the problem. The main cause of the problem was Joseph was a little baby, and Lord, oh, guess what? I had a little dream. You guys are all gonna bow to me, which I frankly would annoy me too if I was an older brother. And so I understand where they're coming from.
Yeah.
And then after that first dream, then Joseph has a second dream, which includes not only his brothers, but his parents as well. Genesis 37, verse 9.
"Listen," he said, "I had another dream, and this time the sun and moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me."
And then in verses 10 and 11, the Bible very clearly says that, first of all, Jacob goes to him and tells him to knock it off. He does. And then it's because his brothers, it says in verse 11, are getting very jealous of him. And then things come to a head when his brothers are off with the flocks, and Jacob sends Joseph to go and check on his brothers in Genesis 37. And he goes to Shechem, and because that's where he thinks they are, and near the town of Shechem, and they're not there. And someone from Shechem says, "Yeah, they're up in Dothan." And so he travels up to Dothan, a little bit more of a trip, and he finally finds them in the fields, getting ready with their sheep and everything, protecting them. Genesis 37:18.
They saw him in the distance, and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him.
And we all kind of know this story, but it's one of the reasons why the writer of Hebrews doesn't fill us in on these things. The writer of Hebrews just tells us a little snippet because he wants us to go back and look at these stories. That's what we're doing. So that's what we're going to do. And we all kind of know the plot against Joseph. His brothers plan on killing him and throwing his body into a pit and then going to dad and saying, "Oh, I'm sorry. In his travels, he wasn't paying attention and he got eaten by a wild animal," or something like that. Um, while they are discussing that, his brother Reuben pipes up. Now you have to remember, Reuben is the oldest son, and it's his responsibility to take care of the entire family. He's the one that's kind of in charge of everything. He's the one that's going to get the birthright when the time comes, and so he's already beginning to look out for his younger brothers, and he's the one that says, "Well, time out. Maybe we shouldn't really do this." And so they decide to stash him in a pit until they can figure out what to do. Bible does say that Reuben was planning on coming back and rescuing Joseph and sending him back to his parents. Unfortunately, that plan kind of got foiled because a caravan of Ishmaelites came by that were heading down the road on their way to Egypt, and they had their big caravan with their spices and all of the stuff, balm and myrrh. And so the brothers all got together. Reuben was not there at the time, and the brothers got together. And since Reuben's not there protecting anyone, they decide to sell Joseph into slavery, ship him off to Egypt. Takes care of the problem. They don't have to worry about killing him because he's going to be a slave in Egypt, and slaves don't last that long, even if they're fairly good slaves and in a good place. That's just the nature of the business. And so they sell him to the Ishmaelites, who haul him away. Reuben shows up then to rescue Joseph, and he's gone. And oh no, and Reuben, the Bible says, tore his jacket. And now they've got to come up with some excuse because they can't now go back to Jacob and say, "Hey, we sold them into slavery." They can't do it. So then they go back to that original plan of, let's pretend he got eaten by wild animals. And so they had taken that very ornate robe and dipped it in some blood that made it look like his. They didn't have DNA testing back then, so they wouldn't be able to tell it was not his. And for all intent and purposes, as far as Jacob is concerned, his son Joseph is now gone. Genesis 37 then tells us what happens when Joseph gets down to Egypt. 37 verse 36.
The Midianites sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. Genesis 39:2 says, "The Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered." Verse 3 and 4 adds, "When his master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything he owned." Verse 5b adds, "The blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, both in the house and in the field."
So they show up in Egypt, and Joseph gets sold to Potiphar. God blesses Joseph, and the knock-on effect is that Joseph's blessings fall on Potiphar as well. And Potiphar realizes this. And so he makes Joseph his major domo for the family, and Joseph runs everything in the household, and everything is turning up great. Things are working out just the way everyone kind of expects them to. Until Genesis 39, verse 7.
Now Joseph was well built and handsome.
Oh, so he
Like
looked
me.
like me. That was
Yeah,
awesome.
I beat
Yeah.
you to it.
Yeah.
And after a while, his master's wife took notice of Joseph, and said, "Come to bed with me."
And of course, Joseph refuses. And the Bible seems to indicate that there were several times that Potiphar's wife tried to get Joseph to sleep with her. And at some point in the future of that, sometime later, she's alone in the house. He's alone in the house. She grabs his cloak and again tries to get him to go to bed with her. Again, he refuses. And not only does he say no, but he wriggles out of his jacket and takes off, which is basically what the Apostle Paul tells us to do in 1 Corinthians 6:18 when he says, flee from sexual immorality. It's exactly what Joseph did. Genesis 39:13-20 then tells us what happens afterwards. The Potiphar's wife makes a big scene in front of the other servants, and when Potiphar comes back to him, tells him that Joseph had tried to rape her, and so Potiphar puts Joseph in prison. But there's something else going on here because the prison that Joseph is put into is a really nice prison. It's not a prison for criminals. Potiphar is the captain of the guard, Pharaoh's guard. He's the head of the CIA or FBI or Mounties if you're up north somewhere. Okay. Um, and so I find it strange that someone that powerful, if Potiphar believed his wife, Joseph wouldn't be around anymore. He'd have been taken out back and disposed of. And instead, he's put into a prison. And interestingly, in chapter 40, verse 3, it tells us that that prison that he's put into is in Potiphar's house.
Hmm.
So I'm thinking, what is going on here? This guy should, if it's true, this guy shouldn't even be alive, and yet he's put in a cushy a prison. Um, and so here's what I'm thinking is going on, and I'm reading between the lines. I don't know if this is true or not, but this is what I'm seeing when I'm reading between the lines. Potiphar is in charge of the security for the Pharaoh. His job is to know everything. And I have a hard time believing that Potiphar doesn't know that his wife has a roving eye, if you understand what I'm saying. And I wonder if when Potiphar's wife goes to him and says, he tried to do this to me, Potiphar pulled Joseph aside and said, hey, Joseph, I got some bad news for you. My wife is a liar. She accused you. Unfortunately, she made it public because she said it in front of all of the servants and everything. And now I have to save face. I can't be seen as being weak in front of the world because my wife is this kind of a person. So I have to punish you. But I'm going to make it real easy for you. We're going to put you in a really nice prison. Um, and frankly, in the end of chapter 39, Joseph goes into this nice prison and almost immediately becomes the head prisoner in charge of the rest of the prison. And so I wonder if Potiphar even went to the chief of the prison guys and said, "Hey, listen, I'm putting this guy in here, but he's a really good guy, and so don't mess with him or you mess with me." I don't know, maybe, but it seems to make sense to me.
Yes.
Um, and so Joseph goes to prison where he has some pretty interesting things that happen to him.
He's going to prison. He's going to prison simply because he tried to live the way he believed God wanted him to live. And he's going to be punished. And following God does not guarantee that we will not face difficulty or be treated unjustly.
Mhm.
It simply promises us that when we go through those things, he will be with us. Now, I'm sure he was in a better prison. I doubt that he had a widescreen TV to watch the Super Bowl on. It's
It was still a prison. It was still a prison.
It was still a prison, and for Joseph, it's going to have to be a time of trusting, and it's going to be a time of ups and downs when things go well and things don't go. And according to Genesis 40, Pharaoh became angry one day with his chief cupbearer and his chief baker. With not a good day for Pharaoh on it. And so he decided to throw them in prison. And of course, they're going to the same prison that Joseph is in. And as Dan noted, as a testimony to Joseph's character and leadership strengths, these men are assigned to Joseph, who will be responsible for them in their care while they are there. Again, a real insight into the character of Joseph and the way God uses him. The rest of Genesis 40 records that each of these men had a dream, and Joseph interpreted them. Remember, God is using him as a dreamer, but he's going to use the dreamer to interpret dreams. Genesis 48 records that Joseph, when he was getting ready to interpret them, made it very clear. He said, do not interpretations belong to God. Only God can do this. He's giving God all the glory, which again is a testimony to his character. And the upshot of it is that he said to the cupbearer, in 3 days, you're going to be released and restored to your old position. And then he turned to the baker and he said, you're not going to be making any more cupcakes for the king or the emperor. In 3 days, you're going to be put to death. Genesis 40, verses 14 and 15 have an interesting take on this. Artie?
When all goes well with you, remember me and show me kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I have done nothing to deserve being put in a dungeon.
So Genesis 40 brings up a really big surprise. Everything happened exactly as God had given the dream to Joseph. And it records that on the Pharaoh's birthday, he threw a feast. Couldn't go to Shady Maple, so he had his men bring in their own feast. And Genesis 40, 21 and 22 says,
he restored the chief cupbearer to his position so that he would once again put the cup into Pharaoh's hand. But he impaled the chief baker, just as Joseph had said to them in his interpretation. Verse 23 records, the chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. He forgot him.
another lesson. Joseph, I'm assuming, thought, okay, God gave me this understanding of the dream. and now it's going to be up to the cupbearer to get me out of here. And I'd love to know what was going through Joseph's mind over the next few weeks. I'm sure he thought initially, well, he went back, but he had a lot of work to do. Greeted his family, whatever, took a vacation to the shore, whatever he was thinking about at that point. But then as time went on, he realized that this cupbearer had forsaken him. In the end, Joseph had to learn that it's going to be God who's going to take care of him, and not his prison friend. Uh, if I had $1 for every time I worked out a problem on my own and God laughed at it, I'd be rich. Because God has his own plan of how and when he's going to do things. And so that's exactly what he does. And Joseph, who was expecting to get out quickly, spends the next 2 years in prison. Then Genesis 41, 1-4 tells us
Pharaoh had a dream. He was standing by the Nile when out of the river there came up 7 cows, sleek and fat.
Hey,
and
that
they
sounds like
grazed,
me.
and they grazed among the reeds. After them, 7 other cows, ugly and gaunt, came up out of the Nile and stood beside those on the riverbank. And the cows that were ugly and gaunt ate up the 7 sleek, fat cows. Then Pharaoh woke up.
And then he went back to sleep. In Genesis 41 notes that he fell asleep again and had a second dream, and that involved 7 heads of grain. Now, in ancient times, people took dreams very seriously. So the next morning, the Pharaoh tries to get an interpretation of them, and he calls in all of his magicians and wise men and says, tell me what this is all about. And no one could help him understand it. Now, this is a critical time. Remember, quite a few years later, King Nebuchadnezzar had a dream. He called in his wise men, asked them to give him his dream and then interpret it. And they said, we can't. And Nebuchadnezzar said, oh, that's no problem. Put them all to death because they can't with it. Well, this was serious for them. But at that particular time, Pharaoh's cupbearer suddenly remembers what Joseph had done, and he tells the Pharaoh all about it. And so immediately the Pharaoh sends for Joseph and asks him to explain it. Joseph replies according to Genesis 41:16, I cannot do it, but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. Always, always giving God the glory for what happens. And Pharaoh told Joseph both dreams, and Joseph looked at him and said, they're really the same message. And he interpreted the dream according to verses 29 and 30. There will be 7 years of abundance, followed by, throughout the land, followed by 7 years of famine that will follow. And then Joseph said, but I've got a plan that will save the Egyptians. And here's what we need to do. Well, during those years of plenty, we need to stash some away so that we'll have extra food when the famine comes. We should be impressed the way he treated all of them. Everybody's going to have it. We're going to help everyone. And so Genesis 41:38 says, the Pharaoh asked his advisors, can you find a man anywhere like this in whom the Spirit of God dwells?
And so, and I just love that part of the story. Pharaoh calls Joseph and says, hey, I hear you can interpret dreams, can you? And Joseph goes, no, but God can. And I'm sure Pharaoh's like, wait a minute, what's going on here? And what's interesting is that in ancient societies, It was kind of the job of the dream interpreters, the priests and the wise men who interpreted dreams, to not only interpret the dreams, but also to come up with a plan to either ward off the consequences of those dreams. And so that's what Joseph does. He does what a typical wise man does. He interprets the dream. There's going to be famine, and we need to start collecting food. And Pharaoh turns around and goes, "Woohoo, you're the man." Genesis 41:41, Mom.
Pharaoh said to Joseph, I hereby put you in charge of the whole land of Egypt.
Okay, I like mine
You're the
better.
man.
Woohoo, you're the man. I think "Woohoo, you're the man" is the King James version, but whatever, Um, and as is noted there, Joseph had the Egyptians then save a portion of the 7 years of plenty or abundance. And then after those years, um, Genesis 41:52.
There was famine in all the other lands, but in the whole land of Egypt there was food. Verse 57 records, all the world came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph because the famine was severe everywhere.
So there's this area-wide famine in the Middle East, and everyone is suffering. And Egypt, because of Joseph's planning and because of Joseph's leadership, they have enough food, not only for themselves, but for other people as well. And God is now setting the stage for Joseph to be reunited with his family. Um, One additional note that's thrown in here, it's kind of off the cuff, but it does play into some things that happen a little bit later on. Joseph in Genesis 41:45, it tells us that Pharaoh is so pleased with Joseph that he gives Joseph a wife. Asnath is his wife. She is, of course, most probably Egyptian. And Joseph marries her. And in verses 50 and 52 of Genesis 41, it tells us what happened.
2 sons were born to Joseph, and Joseph named his firstborn Manasseh and said, it is because God has made me forget all my trouble and all my father's household. The second son he named Ephraim and said, it is because God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering.
And again, names are important. And so Manasseh means to forget, and God made him forget all of his troubles. Ephraim means twice blessed and or twice fruitful. And so he says it's because God has made me fruitful. And then a very interesting story episode happens because Joseph's family shows up. And we all kind of know that story fairly well too. Genesis 42:1 and 2 kind of sets the stage for what is going to happen.
When Jacob learned that there was grain in Egypt, he said to his sons, why do you just keep looking at each other? He continued, I have heard that there is grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy some for us so that we may live and not die.
I'm sure that they were all on Facebook saying, "Hey, does anyone have any food?" and stuff like that. And someone said, "Yeah, Egypt's got plenty. They've got a real good guy down there, and he's in charge." And of course, they didn't know it was Joseph at the time. Um, Interestingly, we wonder about Jacob's faith in God, but it seems clear that God is going to provide for Jacob and the family through Joseph, even though they don't know it. The rest of that chapter kind of records how all of the brothers, except for Joseph's full brother, Benjamin, the youngest, child of Jacob. All the rest of them make their trip to Egypt. And as soon as Joseph sees these people coming in, even though it's been 15, 20 years maybe, he immediately recognizes them, but they don't recognize him. Why not? Well,
Yeah.
because he's Egyptian. He walks like an Egyptian, talks like an Egyptian, he like an Egyptian, he's got an Egyptian haircut, he's got an Egyptian wife, he's got an Egyptian house, an Egyptian chariot. He is authentic. And so they're not even thinking this guy was our brother and he was a slave. They were thinking he was long gone. And so they don't recognize him. They're still living as Hebrews, and he recognizes them immediately. And the writer of the writer of Genesis notes in here that Joseph, as soon as he sees his brothers, all of that stuff that happened when he was a kid, particularly those dreams he had about them bowing down, suddenly come back to him. Um, and Joseph decides he is going to test his brothers. And so immediately he has them thrown into prison, which is kind of a bummer. They show up at the gate and they're like, you guys, prison. I don't know if it was the same prison. If I don't know what was going on, Potiphar, because Joseph's now in charge of Potiphar too. So he doesn't, which I think is really interesting. Um, but they're arrested as spies. They go to prison for 3 days. Genesis 42, 21 and 22.
They said to one another, "Surely we are being punished because of our brother. We saw how distressed he was when he pleaded with us for his life, but we would not listen. That's why this distress has come on us." Reuben replied, "Didn't I tell you not to sin against the boy? But you wouldn't listen. Now we must give an accounting for his blood."
And even though it's been 20 years, this horrible thing has happened to them where they've been thrown into prison. And something that monumental is punishment for something they did monumental. And the thing they immediately go back to, I'm guessing God brings it to their minds as well, is, do you remember what we did to Joseph? We sent him down to Egypt, and now we're here in Egypt as slaves. They did not recognize Joseph, but their conscience reminded them of what they had done. After 3 days, Joseph releases everyone except for Simeon. Now you have to understand, Simeon is the second born. Reuben is the firstborn. Simeon's the second born. Joseph releases everyone, including Reuben, and I think that might be for two reasons. Number one, Reuben did kind of try and help Joseph out a little bit there. But also, Reuben is that firstborn son, and he is still responsible for everyone. And in that culture, you go after the second-born son. You don't mess with the firstborn son because he has quite a bit more authority than the other kids. And so maybe Joseph was thinking along that lines. If they need to go back to Israel, and Reuben needs to be there, but Simeon, he's the second son. I'm the second son. It doesn't matter to me, whatever. Put me in prison. I don't care. um, and so that's what Joseph does. He provides food for them. He gives them some bags of grain, and he tells them, if you want Simeon out of prison, you've got to bring Benjamin, your youngest, back here. And he also sneaks the money back into their bags that they brought for the grain, which is going to cause a little bit of problems when they discover that. Genesis 42 ends with them then having this big discussion back in Israel about going back to Egypt and getting Simeon out, taking Benjamin with him. And Genesis 42, verse 36, Jacob is not too thrilled with that particular plan.
"You have deprived me of my children. Joseph is no more, and now Simeon is no more. And now you want to take Benjamin. Everything is against me.
And again, Reuben steps up as the firstborn, as the one who's got a little bit more authority and the role of protector. And he says he will assume responsibility for the safe return of Benjamin. And Jacob firmly says, no, 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 no. Please, no.
But, and that's a big but, famine continued. The food they brought back from Egypt is gone. And Judah then detailed the threat of Joseph if Benjamin did not come back. We're not going to get anything. So after some discussion, Jacob agreed, but said, look, if we're going back down there, we got to take gifts. And they had some gifts from that area that were important to the Egyptians: honey, spices, pistachio, almond nuts, and I think some peppermint stick ice cream.
I
It
think
was
that was in there.
all there. So they sent them on down and said, and whatever you do, take that money back.
Yeah.
Because when you get there, they're going to say you stole the money, and you're going to say, no, we didn't, but somehow or other it got dropped in our bags, and here we brought it back for you. We're as honest as can be. And then, of course, you're going to need more grain. And so here's some additional silver to pay for the new grain. Genesis 43, 13, and 14.
Take your brother also and go back to the man at once. And may God Almighty grant you mercy before that man, so that he will let your other brother and Benjamin come back with you. As for me, if I'm bereaved, I am bereaved.
I'll take what it goes. We've got to do something to get the food. So they all go back down to Egypt, and Joseph not only welcomes them, but invites them to have a meal at his house. And at that point, they think, you know what, we've got to be honest here. Let's return the silver to Joseph. And Joseph says, no, that wasn't a mistake. You can keep that. Genesis 43, 23.
It's all right, he said. Don't be afraid. Your God, the God of your father, has given you treasure in your sacks. I received your silver. Then he brought Simeon out to them.
Genesis 44 opens by noting that Joseph gave them grain and told the stewards again, put the money back in their sacks, and they head out. But Joseph added something to that. Genesis 44, 2.
Then put my cup, the silver one, in the mouth of the youngest one's sack, along with the silver for his grain.
They head out, assuming they're going back. They're just down the road, and Joseph says to his servants, go get them, bring that silver cup back. And of course, they go and they found it, no big surprise, in Benjamin's sack. And they were brought back to Joseph. And after some give and take that's recorded there, they were told, look, go back and get your father and bring him to the boy. And Judah begged to take Benjamin's place there. Genesis 45, 1 and 2.
Then Joseph could no longer control himself before all his attendants, and he cried out, have everyone leave my presence. So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him, and Pharaoh's household heard about it.
At this point, of course, the brothers panicked, and Joseph assured them that God was in control and he was not going to punish them for it. Genesis 45, verses 17 and 18.
Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Tell your brothers, do this. Load your animals and return to the land of Canaan, and bring your father and your families back to me. I will give you the best of the land of Egypt, and you can enjoy the fat of the land."
And then the rest of Genesis 45 records the supplies and the gifts that Joseph gave them, with an extra gift for Benjamin. Genesis 47 records that Joseph, when he came and reported to the Pharaoh that his family had come and they're settled in Canaan, in Goshen rather, and Joseph brought Jacob to the Pharaoh, and Jacob offers a blessing on the Pharaoh. And then in Genesis 28, Joseph brings his two sons to Jacob. And Genesis 48, 5.
Your two sons born to you in Egypt before I came to you here will be reckoned as mine. Ephraim and Manasseh will be mine, just as Reuben and Simeon are mine.
In other words, he adopted them and as his legitimate children, and therefore in the line of all the blessings that would flow through him to others. And interestingly, when he gets ready to bless him, he crosses his arms and blesses Ephraim first, as if he were the firstborn, which he wasn't, but went on. And then Jacob announced that he was about to die, and Genesis 49 records his final blessing on his sons and their sons. He died. Genesis 50 records the mourning of Joseph for his father. Then he asks the Pharaoh for permission to take his father's remains back to Canaan. So Jacob is going to be taken back at this point for burial. The Pharaoh obviously grants him permission, and he says, not only will you be able to go back, but I'm going to send some important people back with you to participate in that. At that point, they come back, and now the brothers are beginning to panic a little bit more. You know, as long as Dad was with us, he protected us. Joseph wasn't going to do any harm because of his father. But now that Dad's gone, I wonder if this is when he's going to take revenge for what we've done to him. So the brothers went to him and said, "Oh, by the way, just so you know, just before Dad died, he instructed you to forgive us." Whether he did or not, I don't know. And they added, interestingly, in that we are your slaves. And then Genesis 50, 19 and 20.
But Joseph said to them, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." Joseph added, according to verse 21, "Don't be afraid. I will provide for you and for your children." And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them.
I think one of the great verses in Genesis is that you intended it for evil, but God was in control. And if God is in control, it will ultimately turn to good on it. We don't need to seek revenge for the things that sometimes happen to us. And Genesis 50 concludes with the closing statement by Joseph, reassures them that in time, God is going to take them back to the land of promise. And when he does, he wants his bones to go back. It then records he died at the age of 110. And then if we jump ahead 400 years, Exodus 13:9 records that Moses took Joseph's bones with them